We have three panelists for this session. Emily Beaulieu is Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Kentucky. She has written a book, written a lot. One of her books is Electoral Protest and Democracy in the Developing World. She is currently doing work in the topics of political violence, projects in ethnic politics, partisan violence, political assassinations, parliamentary brawls, fun things like that. So Walter Mebane is professor in both the Department of Political Science and in Statistics at the University of Michigan. He's written in a wide variety of topics, including important studies that apply statistical methods to uncovering cases of political corruption and lost votes, and in many cases doing something equally important, which is debunking some claims. He's well known for pioneering the area of electoral forensics, which he's both written about, and I noticed, looks like this semester he was teaching about at the University of Michigan. Oh, you're on sabbatical. Oh, well, I'm glad you weren't. You're doing better than I did on sabbatical. And then Ron Rivest, immediately to my left, is Institute Professor here at MIT. By the way, that's really tough shit here, use a technical term. There's only 10 of them, so Institute Professor. But he also hangs out at Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, which we call Course 6 at MIT, so call it Course 6, not EECS. Well, you can call it EECS, I guess, also. And the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL, so some more MIT nomenclature. He's been part of the VTP since its beginning, and is a great cryptographer, and is also one of the pioneers in risk-limiting audits. So I think we're going to start with Ron.
Thanks, Charles. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see everybody. Mike? We got no mic. I got a mic, yeah, okay. Mike? Good. Turn your mic. Thank you. We on now? Yeah, pleasure to see everybody here. So we have some slides somewhere. I can't lecture sitting down. It's just part of the profession or something. I don't know. So there we go. So I've got a few minutes. I'm going to talk about two aspects of auditing that I've been working on, K-cuts and Bayesian auditing. And by the end of this brief introduction, you should have a pretty good feel of both of them because they're both actually fairly simple. So what are audits about? First part is sampling cast paper ballots. You want to be able to take a sample of them somehow. The second part is figuring out what the sample ballots tell you about the reported election results. K-cuts are relevant to the first part, how you pick the paper ballots at random. And Bayesian audits are related to the second part as to how you figure out what that sample tells you about the reported election outcomes. So that, in a nutshell, is what audits are about, or tabulation audits are about. And risk-limiting audits are related to Bayesian audits, as you'll see. So let's do them one by one. Sampling with K-cut. This is a new technique that Mayuri Sridhar and I developed. Mayuri's sitting over here. Raise your hand, Mayuri. She's doing on her master's thesis. Master's thesis will be ready any time now, right? Maybe in a couple weeks. So how do you find a random ballot? Sampling requires finding random ballots, one after the other, from different piles or batches of precincts of ballots. The counting is sort of the standard method. Philip and I worked on that in the early days of risk-limiting audits, and there are methods for that and websites that help support that. You generate a random number, and you count down to that ballot in the stack of ballots. K-cut is the new method. You perform a number of cuts. K is a variable here. K might be 6. You perform 6 cuts. Each cut is like cutting a deck of cards. You take some portion of the top and put it on the bottom. And then when you're done, you take the top ballot that's on the stack at the end of that. That's all it is. Here is election officials in Michigan, Kalamazoo, doing the counting method. So you count the ballots one by one. But if you've got a stack of 901 and you're asked to count down to ballot number 572, you can see that's going to take a while. I'm not going to show you the whole counting process. Right? So that's K-cut. How do you do it? If you Google on your phone for random number generator, Google pops up a nice little random number generator. You can pop in your min and your max, say 1 to 99. You hit the generate button, you get a new random number like 17. And then you take about, say, 17%, eyeballing it off the top of the stack, and you put it on the bottom. Do that 6 times, and take the top ballot. That's it. That's K-cut. Very easy to work. Okay? And it doesn't depend on how big the stack is. K is 6, no matter how big the stack is. Actually, I think we can do better than 6. We're doing the math to argue that you can do better than 6. Here's the video for doing K-cut. Same team, same stack. They nicely arrange themselves on opposite side of the table. First cut. There we go. Push the app on the phone to generate your next number. They get maybe 20% or something. They take that, put that down, second cut. All right? Now we do the third cut. I don't know what number they got here. I didn't record that. Maybe 85% or something. It's okay to eyeball it, put it on top. And then if they were all, the sixth cut, you'd be done. The top ballot would be the one you take. Okay, that's K-cut. Much faster if the stacks are big. Maybe not quite as uniform, and that's where the math comes in. Okay, although there's errors in the counting as well. So remarks, maybe 5 times faster. It really depends on who's doing it, what the numbers are, and so on. But it's noticeably faster, as you can imagine, especially for big batches. For small batches, counting maybe just as well. Because of the slight non-uniformity, you may want to reduce your risk limit a bit from, say, 5% to 4.5% or something, just to account for the residual non-uniformity. My areas thesis has all the math for that. It doesn't work for ballot comparison audits where you're trying to get a particular ballot. If you're trying to get a ballot that has a particular imprinted number, K-cut doesn't do that. It just gives you a random ballot, so it's better for ballot polling and may not work for ballot comparison in general. And details, there's a preliminary version of our paper up in archive, 811-08811. So that's K-cut. Bayesian audits, second topic. So how do you interpret the results you got from the sample? I'll use an example. The audit that we did, the pilot audit was done in Rochester Hills, Michigan this week, Monday. The reported election results had 22,999 yes votes on this proposition, 12,343 no, 1,324 other, maybe invalid votes, and so on. Those are reported results. If you draw a sample of 76 ballots, as we did, you see that there were 50 voting yes, 26 voting no in the sample. So what does that mean? Right? How do you do the math to crunch the numbers and figure out, does this confirm the results or not? So I want to compare RLAs with Bayesian. Philip did a good job of doing that introduction already. This is sort of repeat some of the same questions, same material. So in RLA, the question is asked, what is the risk? Well, that's the probability that if the reported winner is incorrect, the audit would nonetheless accept it if the audit stopped now. That's the definition of risk. Nice definition. I like that definition. It's a definition you want to use if you can. Bayesian audits ask a slightly different question. What's the probability the reported winner would lose if all ballots were examined? Sounds very close, but it's actually subtly different. And we can call this the upset probability. Okay? And actually, these two questions, if you answer them, tend to give very comparable results. And you can actually crunch the numbers both ways on a typical audit and see how they look. And we'll do that with these results. So what's the probability that the reported winner would lose if all the ballots were examined? How do you do that? And one of the nice things about the Bayesian audit is you can actually sort of see how this could roll out. And I'll show you in the next slide how that rolls out. So here's the method. So you draw your sample, 76 ballots, say, and you look at them. You audit them, interpret what the voter intended on those ballots. Now we want to imagine looking at the remainder of the ballots. But I don't want to actually pull any more ballots because I want to use the sample that I've got. But I can imagine looking at the remaining ballots. And for each ballot, I can sort of imagine what it might say. How do I imagine what it might say? Well, it's going to be like the other ballots. It's going to be like the sample I've already drawn. So that's exactly what you do. You look for the remaining ballots. We pretend to look at them. And for each one, we simulate what you might see, replacing the actual look at a paper ballot with a copy of a randomly drawn or simulated earlier ballot. You're just pretending. So just looking at all the ballots sort of first from the sample real, and then the extension in simulation mode. And then you got your collection of all these ballots. You can find the winner. You've got a routine that finds the winner. No matter what the election rule is, it could be IRV or anything. You find the winner for that collection of ballots. Now, this was a probabilistic process. I picked random ballots to replace when I did this simulation. So this is an extension that could give different results depending on how you do it, but you get a probability distribution on these extensions. You just do this many times, 10,000 times on the computer. Laptops are very fast. It takes a few seconds. Do that many times and just see what fraction of the time on these extensions the reported winner loses. And that's it. If you don't get a number that's less than 5%, say, you can repeat with a larger sample. So that's the Bayesian audit on one slide, okay? Very simple. You just pretend to look at all the ballots. You have the sample first, and the others you sort of simulate by looking at earlier ballots. Okay. Here's a figure that explains it. You draw a sample of 76, but we had 36, was it 36,000? What was the number? I don't even remember the number. Yeah, 36,000 altogether. So we want to draw, oh, there we go, draw an extension, but these we're not going to actually go look at the paper ballots. We're going to sort of pretend we look at them, imagine what they would look like based on the best evidence we had of what the population looks like, which in this case so far is just the sample we've got. So each element of the extension is a copy of a random ballot to its left. Say we can pick one of the random sample elements at random. Say we pick a ballot that says no. We copy that, put that in the extension. We do that again. Pick a ballot to the left that says yes. We copy that. And we might even pick a copy of a ballot we've already copied, so the N might be, so that left N is copied to make the right-hand N. And we do this all the way until we're done with the extension. So this gives us a simulation of what we would get if we looked at all the ballots. And then we can ask who won in that extension, do that many times, and see what fraction of the time we get different results than the reported outcome. That's all the Bayesian audit is. Very simple to explain. So if you're trying to get your head around how you might do the math, this is one way of doing the math. The risk limiting audits do it a different way. Do they give different results? Well, for the Rochester Hills audit, here's what we got. The risk measured by the SWEET tool, Kelly Ottoboni, who's one of Philip's students, she's not here, used the SWEET tool that Philip mentioned earlier and got a risk measured at 2.1%. The Bayesian results gave somewhat comparable results, 99.7% of the time. Yes won in these extensions, and no won about 0.3% of the time. And Marie ran this software here called something called BP tool that's open source, and you can find online as well. So they both methods confirm the reported outcome. So Bayesian methods are perhaps easier to understand. I described it on one slide, everything you need to know to go implement this actually. And they tend to confirm the same kinds of results on the elections. We haven't found cases where they're wildly different. But they're different. They're different definitions and they're different approaches slightly. But they can both crunch the numbers on the same sample. You can run your risk limiting audit and on the side have the Bayesian software looking at the sample results and saying, what does the Bayesian method say as well? And that's what typically we saw this week, for example, on the Michigan audits. So the Bayesian methods are nice not only because they're simple to understand, but they extend to ballot comparison audits. So I described a ballot polling audit with what we had there. Hybrid audits, having both two strata, CVR and non-CVR strata. That's more challenging to do with risk limiting audits, but the SWEET tool does that. We have software for that as well. Extends to IRV, RCV, and other kinds of things. As you can see from the description, anytime you've got a ability to compute the winner, you can run a Bayesian audit, because that's all you need from the voting method is a way to compute the winner. You compute the winner on an extended, simulated set of ballots that you could have drawn. And this is written up in a paper that you can see here too, 1801-00528. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
So I started working on what I call election forensics nowadays in the mid-2000s. Started working on election forensics, as I call it now, in the mid-2000s, 2005 really, when the challenge was computer scientists and others, the Caltech MIT project were all up in arms about electronic voting machines, and the real push was there to get, paper, voter verified paper ballots and that kind of thing. VVPATs and all that lingo was there. And I thought, well, what if we don't have that? So think of Georgia, for example, where we still today do not have paper ballots and huge problems in Georgia, and a few other jurisdictions in the United States, let alone other places. And so I thought, if we don't have paper, are we just stuck? Or is there something to do? And so the answer could be we're just stuck, but I have a research project that's been going on for an unfortunately long time that hasn't reached the conclusion I should work on something else yet. So the other aspect of this, the title here is Beyond Audits. It's also because I think the scope of kinds of problems that can happen in elections, lack of integrity of elections, to have an even broader concept than election forensics, certainly are beyond what audits can detect, at least the kind of, is the count right? Did the winner actually win if you trust the count of ballots? The so-called broader process audits can get more at the process of running the election could be wrong, but the audit process won't necessarily tell you that the challenger was assassinated in front of the Kremlin, for example, or put in prison, or that there was an information campaign that misled some voters, and the kind of attacks we've seen in recent countries, some of them near and dear to us. And so the idea is not necessarily to diagnose a particular path to a problem, and here's the definition that I'm using for election forensics in a sense. It's an effort to use statistical methods to determine whether the results of an election accurately reflect the intentions of the electors. And the last part is what makes it really interesting, because you have to take into account the fact that people in politics act strategically, and politics is complicated and so forth. But the idea wants to get the outcome right, and there are many, many ways that things can go wrong, so I tend to use frauds because they're plural. This is beyond election audits. It includes audits maybe as a particular part, though I tend not to focus on my own work. There are people working on it for many of them already, and you hear many of them in the future talks in this conference here. But I want to give you some examples of this to kind of illustrate the couple of bullet points I have up here, and this will just illustrate the results, not that it's relatively easy to detect what we call anomalies. We, being Alan Hicken and I, my colleague at Michigan, came up with this word that's not decisive about what's going on, but things look weird. So you have lots of ways to see that things look weird, and so that's relatively easy to get statistical confidence that something looks weird. You have a pattern you think isn't weird. You have a test to see if you're different from that pattern. Hey, it looks weird. The problem is figuring out why it looks weird. In particular, is it due to, again, the complexities of normal politics, or is it due to some malicious actor doing something that you want to call fraudulent? So I'm going to have 4 examples of that with data from some things I've developed over the last decade or so. And then if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about a non-numerical data collection that involves machine learning using Twitter data to try to observe things to expand the scope of the information we use. So just a couple of slides about anomalies. Alan and I developed these points when we presented. We had a grant from USAID, so in 2015 we gave these highlight points. And I won't spend time going over every element here. It's just basically you want a method that doesn't have false negatives or false positives, uses all the data and is systematically. Very often, especially if we're talking about elections outside the United States, and Emily and I were just discussing this point, you don't have the ballots and all this kind of nice, quiet kind of stuff. You have maybe polling station level observations, but you ought not to evaluate, oh, here are the ballots I managed to get, or here are the polling station results I managed to get, and also assume it's okay. You need to have data from everywhere if you possibly can. So you need methods that can handle such data. It's also maybe different from having observers that haphazardly tend to be in places, and observer practices have improved a bit since just haphazardly go and look around, but that's part of the scope of this. We also propose to have methods that can tell where things happen by looking at the results of the election, and so we developed some tools to be able to do that, and we should have some measure of uncertainty. And ideally, this would be like a Bayesian sense of uncertainty, but when we're working on some stuff that gives that in a sense of being able to say how likely it was that something happened, as opposed to our test merely gave this result. The advantages of election forensics, and this is still true 4 years later, I guess, or 3 years later, that it does rely on objective data, and it does provide statistical estimates and all that kind of stuff. And the disadvantage is, and this is either a disadvantage or this is a feature if you like it, you never get a decisive answer from statistical analysis. Someone says, is it fraudulent? And I could say, well, it sure looks fraudulent, but that's not proof. And so I, a long time, thought this was a guide to do the kind of things they're doing in North Carolina now, where they have police investigations, getting subpoenas, and actually look, that's the kind of follow-up you need to do, at least from a legal sense, to establish it in law and actual science don't really play well together. But in that case, I think we'll get an answer. But the statistics can't give you a decisive answer, but they can be highly suggestive and certainly help tell you where to spend your resources better than just wasting your time looking around. So that's that. So I want to get to my first example, Honduras. And so Honduras came up. I teach a class, as was mentioned, on election forensics. It's mostly seniors who need to satisfy their QR2 requirement in the class, I guess. So they're social science majors. A few real scientists come in, but not usually. So this came up. This Honduras election happened in late November of 2017, and so I put it on the final exam. So these tables from Honduras come from the final exam, so it has a feature about that for them. So the key feature of this is, and I got contacted by somebody in Honduras who sent me the data and so forth, asking me, what do I think of this election? So I didn't write about this because it was right in the middle of exam period, but some other people did about it, but I got to use up my exam. So you see that the winning party, called Nacional here, beat the loser, the second place party, and the margin down here at the bottom, I guess there's a laser pointer here, is 52,000 votes, and it jumped ahead of him. Wow, that was fast. 52,000 votes, roughly speaking. Keep that number in mind, okay? So we do some diagnostics. This is the kind of table you get from the so-called election forensics toolkit, which I won't talk much more about. You can find more about that by looking at my website, for example, or the papers I have around. But this is a final exam, so some of the numbers here are useful, some of them are useless. The kids had to figure out which ones are useful and useless. I'll give you a hint. The skewness and kurtosis numbers here are useless. 2BL is ambiguous because it's sensitive to almost everything. But the key only numbers interesting here are the numbers in red, and so the under P05s, the number, one of them is significantly different from 0.2. And that's a number which sort of is interpreted as saying, some agents were being hired, in a sense, to do vote buying or something like that. So there's a way people are faking the votes where they want to be caught doing it. They want to get credit doing it, right? And so that may hint at that, but mostly things don't look too bad in this election from these particular numbers. However, we have more tools in our toolkit, and so one of them is something called the likelihood finite mixture model. We're developing a Bayesian version of this, which is about to be released. I won't go into details at all about what it is, but this is a positive model of what frauds are, as opposed to looks weird. This is saying this is fraud. And so what you get is an estimate, and you see the FI number there is 0.13, and that tells you that 13%, there's a 13% probability of fraud, incremental fraud as it's called, happening. That's a pretty high number, 13%, more than 1 out of 10 polling places have, fraud. Is that what that number means? How many votes does that correspond to? Well, again, out of this method, we can pretend to get an estimate of the number of fraudulent votes. And this is what makes Honduras really interesting for me, is that the number of fraudulent votes down here in the bottom table is about 56,000 fraudulent votes. And you remember the margin of victory was 52,000. Okay, so this is one of the very few cases I've ever seen in the hundreds of elections I've analyzed where the number of fraudulent votes estimated by any of these models is actually bigger than the margin of victory. So a couple of people at Georgetown, Irfan Nuruddin and Joel Simmons, have also produced a paper they did before I did this, and they've actually used the time at which things were reported to argue that this election was affected sort of by a Mexico 88 problem, where they were counting, and then stopped. The system went quiet for 72 hours or some computer glitch, so to speak, for a day or 2 days, and then they resumed, and suddenly everything was different and the winter was happening. So there's a paper that's, I think, under review now talking about that stuff. So there's deeper argument. Again, these folks aren't police on the ground. They're at Georgetown. But it seems like there's fraud in this election pretty clearly. Okay, second example, I call it the title here, Wisconsin and Michigan, but I only talk about Wisconsin on the slides here. Michigan is similar, but the data aren't quite as good, and I'm only going to give a brief version of this. So you may remember, as mentioned earlier here, there were recounts in 2016, the presidential election in Wisconsin and Michigan, and a partial one completed in Pennsylvania, partial in Michigan as well. But Wisconsin completed a recount, And I won't get into details what they mean by recount because it's intricate.
Yeah.
But Matt Bernard, especially, who got mentioned already before, is a grad student at Michigan, works with Al Halderman mainly. So he managed to get the recount data from these states. And then he and I worked together to get a whole bunch of other information. And so long story short, this is a summary that we put together. And this is the difference in the vote count between the initial vote count and the post-recount count, right? So if the number is positive, that means there were more votes in the recount for Donald Trump than in the original count, right? And you see down here, this 246 number, I won't use a laser pointer because I screwed up before, I'll hazard it. No, I won't. So the 246 is pretty large. Mostly the numbers are small, mostly at 0. You see that's the modal number. But there's a couple of really big ones in 246. If you do this for Clinton, it looks similar. There's mostly 0, but there's a couple of really big ones, not as big as the Trump number here. So the question is, what's going on? Wisconsin is, I think, still, but used to be very good for transparency because they put a lot of stuff you can just get by searching the web on the used to be called Government Accountability site. They changed their name now. But they also have each county's minutes that they kept during the recount process were available online. So I hired a couple of students, and they read and coded all these minutes in all these counties. And we pulled out these reasons that the counties gave for changing the counts between the original count and the recount period, right? And we also then, I did the number of times at which this occurred across in these minutes. And so that's the big N column. And then the numbers under Trump and Clinton are like how many votes on average were changed associated with this message, was this explanation. And you can skip to the bottom, the second row from the bottom. Voting machine error is far and away the largest mean change. It's 7.83 or something like that for both Trump and Clinton. So voting machine error, and if you look at it, I don't have the slide here, but if you match it up, that's what explains the 246 and the 173 number that's just for Clinton and so forth. The 2- and 3-digit numbers are explained as voting machine error, generally. And so that's interesting. And then there's other kinds of reasons they say. Of course, these are the reasons that the recounters said happened. Who knows whether any of this is malicious behavior, but of course the hypothesis that we're pursuing here is that the machines were hacked from Russia, and it was some machine problem induced by hacking born by Russia, Macedonian teenagers or whatever, going to Wisconsin and eating cheese and manipulating machines maybe. But that was the hypothesis here. So voting machine error looks like the kind of thing that might be a symptom of hacking that happened to get caught, right? So this is really tricky. Of course, ideally, the recount happened, and you might say the audit is not necessary, but the recount was so wonky that I wouldn't say it at all qualifies even as giving any confidence really about the results. If anyone thinks differently, they can speak up, but we don't even know exactly what type of machine. It gives some confidence, I'll give you that, but it's not.
We did better than any other state.
Absolutely, yes, then it wasn't good enough is what I'm saying here to satisfy the kind of criteria that Philip Stark certainly supports about having confidence, because we don't even know what type of machine some of the ballots were originally cast on, or I'll have another slide about that. So here's the kind of technology. We did a merger, what votes are counted on what machines and so forth, and there's two kinds of machines actually. There's a vote machine used on the original day and then the recounts, and it's very complicated. But long story short, it's not possible, and they didn't do something called an audit, but they satisfied the machine. And many of the recounts were based on running the paper ballots through another machine, so they weren't hand counted. This got really complicated. But the reason here that this is difficult from my election forensics point of view, so we see the weirdness of the couple of really big counts, which may be associated with the voting machine error and so forth. But here's the maps that show the distribution of the different technologies across Wisconsin. And from the clustering, you can see the machines are not randomly assigned to places in Wisconsin. So very democratic places around Madison, around Milwaukee especially, have one type of machine, and other places. So suppose you say the machines are associated with some kind of anomaly. You don't know whether that's because of the machine or because of the voters being different, partisan-wise, education-wise or any other consideration, maybe more errors. So disentangling what even the associations are is really kind of a hard social science problem, and we lack data to be able to do that. So Matt and I made some efforts to build a model to try to do this, and we ended up concluding that there was no evidence. There was evidence against the idea that the machines were hacked, by the way. So we ended up finding weak but positive, I think, evidence for that. And I won't get into that kind of analysis we did. But this is a challenge in post hoc kind of things in a situation where audits that are as rigorous as people are talking about doing here, they did a recount, and the best in the country, and very good, but just basic things were challenging to have that confidence, and we can maybe help a little bit here. Another example is Kenya in 2017. So another case where we got contacted, and Ron was involved in this. First contact where some folks in Kenya, the losers, of course, reached out to a group of us in August of 2017. And long story short, I am doing some work for them. They gave me some data. And here's what the toolkit showed up. And the bright red bar tells you everything looks whopping anomalous. And a reporter picked this up and published a paper saying Mebane says the election is fraudulent the day before the Supreme Court of Kenya annulled the election. So the Carter Center, everybody said, hey, who's that guy? So anyway, long story short, it turned out that maybe there was less there than meets the eye. I would say the election was really wrong. My analysis had no role in the court decision as far as I know, because it didn't exist at the time they were doing their deliberations. But if you also just plot the overall distribution of voter, you see a strongly bimodal pattern of support, places where the Kenyatta, the red line, you can't really see the colors too well, it's bimodal, so they're getting almost 100% or almost 0% of the vote in various parts of the country, and normally you would think this is really terrible. And I've taken Kenya generally as one of the hardest cases for election forensics, because it turns out the bimodality doesn't exist at every county, because ethnicity is a big deal in Kenya. Ethnicity is kind of like their core focal point, and I know almost nothing about Kenyan elections, but I know a bit more now after giving some talks about this and talking to people who know about Kenya. And it's weird about Kenya is that ethnicity is the most important variable, and no one has a measure of ethnicity. Seriously? Okay, so, but anyway, so I did analysis by county separately. You can see mostly it's only unimodal distributions in each county. A couple of them, like Lamu here, has a bimodal distribution, but again, it's ethnicity that's going on there. So if I do the analysis separately by county, and this is just a couple of selected counties, you get, the main message is there's much less red in the picture, so it looks better by the Election Forensics Toolkit standards, but not perfect, because Nairobi here, or Muranga, whatever that is still kind of problematic. And then I use the finite mixture model, which is not really suited to doing this, analyzing how many votes were fraudulently attributed to both the winner and the loser, because long story about Kenya, it all looks sketchy to me. You can see that some of the votes were gained by both candidates if you force this method to give you that answer. And the overall number of votes purloined is probably about 50 or 60,000. So I know the losers were very disappointed to see this analysis, but this is what I said once I had time to work on this. I don't know if Ron wants to talk about this at all, but we had also, after this election, made a big stand-up. We were going to do a big data gathering effort to support a Bayesian audit in Kenya, and we were talking to various funders for this, and then the opposition party decided to boycott the election, and that was it, so that went away. And I don't know if you responded to the email from Congo we just got last week, but that's another story. So Russia, one of my favorite countries, Russia, as everyone knows, has election-type events. And that's, I didn't invent that. That's a quote from a Russian. And so they started having such events after 2003. And the 2003 and 2000 elections were probably kind of real. But after 2004 on, they're more fake in various ways. It doesn't mean none of the votes are honest, but they're always, it's never uncertain who the winner is going to be, I'll put it that way. And so this is one of the statistics for the people faking votes in a way that they can be detected kind of pattern, which is the odd thing about Russia. We plotted the data, you can see spikes in the distribution and say, this isn't secret, they want to get credit because you can just see it right there. So that happens pretty much, and the number of that happens is pretty much the same across many of these elections, presidential and Duma elections. And if I estimate the finite mixture model, I can see the alpha parameter here is sort of telling you that the basic mechanism, among others, that goes in Russia is just stuffing the ballot box or augmenting the turnout, the registered voter count, so they can have votes cast that aren't associated with anybody. And the kind of two modes of doing it, 3.3 is do it a lot, 1.7 is do it not a whole lot, but still do it. And then the number of fraudulent votes, and here's a point about the, I can't call it debunking necessarily. We got in a big fight with some Russians about the last number here for the 2016 Duma election. We said, Kirill Kalina and I, my former grad student, who's got a PhD, so he actually finished, we published a paper called Russia Giving Us the Finger or something like that about statistics, and we saw them faking numbers in a way that were perfect because we told them this is how we do the analysis. But you can see it's about 1 million, 2 million votes faked in the 2016 row here for this particular method, which again, I don't believe this necessarily, but it's probably right by an order of magnitude if you believe this model. But Russians say it's 10 times that. It's 10, 15 million fake votes, and we got a big fight with some Russians in a paper that maybe somehow it's not appeared, but it should have appeared 6 months ago, so in Russia, and so you have to read that. So that's one thing. So I'll say a couple of words about the Twitter data. So we're trying to gather data from Twitter because we can't really get good data from the official complaints in the US, and I could do a long story about that. So in 2016, we gathered these things, and these are the kinds of incidents and descriptions of the incidents that we had enough data to be able to say anything about in 2016. And so it's like line length, no line, long line, for example, polling place event, which is like voting, I voted successfully, and so forth. Election system complaints, I hate the Electoral College, for example. Registration problems and that kind of stuff. Here's a picture that gives you an understanding of what an incident is. So here you see the tweet includes, if you follow the URLs in it, an image of a smiling couple with an I voted sticker on each of them. And so they obviously voted successfully. They're at an early voting site, and you can see there's no line. So pretty rich picture if you code that. That's an incident. So it's positive, not necessarily negative as well. Here's the overall count of the number of things we got. Most of them are polling place, either early voting or absentee or election day voting experiences, some positive, mostly positive, some negative. Line length is not that bad. This is a map showing where these things happened, and we have data from virtually every county, at least one observation like this. Overall, there are 310,000 such observations, and so that's pretty good. Shout out to Adam Rao, who is a former student at Michigan, who's now working here at MIT in political science. So hi, Adam. So here's a distribution over a day. You can see on the single day that had the most events was election day, but most incidents were before election day. And there was one other thing I wanted to say that got lost here. Oh, so we have this Twitter data collection, and there's this another thing called election line, which, show of hands, anybody involved with election land, I meant to say? Yeah, so election land also uses social media, Twitter, and other sources to get tips. I read their 2016, I'm not involved in it, so I read the report. You can correct me if I get something wrong. So they get tips from social media, and then they have a team of thousands, at least 600 students in 2016. I don't know how many they had this time, connected to journalists and then lawyers. So they want to verify that incidents happened and then maybe do a sick the lawyers on them on election day kind of activity. And they had a table in the report talking about how many tips they got from Twitter, specifically in 2016, and that number was 775. So I figure a tip in that sense is probably like an adverse event, incident, and we have 57,000 adverse incidents. And one reason they might not find the kind of thing we find incidents useful is that we have a very hard time saying exactly where the thing happened. And if you make that filter, you're going to reduce this at least by probably 2 orders of magnitude. So maybe that's the explanation for the difference there. But the last thing I want to say here is about even if we get this testimony data with maybe pictures, we find a big, this is work that we're hoping to submit pretty soon. So we find a big partisan difference in what people report. For example, Republicans, so to speak, are much less likely to report, I voted successfully. If you see somebody smiling with an I voted sticker, they're probably a Democrat. And it's very hard to say why that is. They didn't really have more problems voting, so I don't know what's going on there, but that's there. They're also less likely to report long lines, and that may be real, but there's big partisan biases in the reports people give, and I don't know why that happens, but that's a feature. So such data can't be trusted necessarily to overcome the problems we have from just analyzing numerical data. We combine the text data with the numerical data, then we'll be able to do a little better with that. Thanks, I'm done.
Great. Thanks, Walter.
All right, I'm up. Test, 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 test. Can y'all hear me? Weird. Should I move it closer? I mean, I'm shouty, so I can definitely.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
There you go. All right. Okay, y'all, I see my role here as really twofold. On the one hand, I am serving as an ambassador from the international elections community to talk to you all who are largely working in the American election context. When I spoke to colleagues at the Carter Center about giving this presentation, they were very excited to know that this work is happening because international democracy promoters and election observers are also interested in the issue of audits, and so they're very excited about this development. But I also feel like my secondary role here is one that my children are very familiar with. We like to call it the wet blanket, whereby we can have a lot of enthusiasm about the possibilities for analyzing and understanding elections, but mine is a little bit of a cautionary tale about broader considerations and concerns that I think are increasingly useful for us to keep in mind here in the States. So at present, the international election community's definition of an audit is very broad, and it describes all of the sort of types of audits that were recognized in the first panel. The distinction that is drawn, right, is that what an audit is not is it is not simply a recount of votes in either partial or total, right? An audit is more all-encompassing, and though they don't make the distinction Philip did of needing it to come before results are certified, it can sometimes happen long after, not too long, but interestingly, it can also sometimes happen before the election occurs, auditing things like voter registers, for example. And so the idea with an audit, though, is that there are some concerns about the election or surrounding the election, either preemptive or in the aftermath, that an audit is meant to address in some way. So that's the basic framework that international actors are working with. One of the big considerations in thinking about audits and sort of thinking about audits best practices is first that issue of who will be in charge of the audit. Who will actually do it? And so it was mentioned the possibility to either have it done sort of internally or by an external third party. The international community's perspective on this is that ideally it's done internally. And that is because we're operating in an election environment where there are concerns about sovereignty, where there wants to be sort of ownership at the local level, with the caveat that particularly when you're employing advanced statistical methods, most election management boards are going to need outside technical assistance. And so although the ideal is sort of an in-house audit job, there are realities of the situation that mean very often it ends up being international actors like the Carter Center or the OAS who become heavily involved in the audit process itself. And then finally, that also speaks to some of the concerns around this ideal of an internal process for auditing within election management bodies, is that we have broader political concerns, right? So this is happening because someone, Walter mentioned, typically the losers, are not happy with the results, want them investigated. And so you need those key stakeholders to be able to observe the audit process, to understand what's going on and to be kept in the loop, but they can't be the ones running the audit. And so this is one of those areas where I would highlight, I mean, to be perfectly frank, as someone who is focused on elections outside of the US, the extent to which partisan actors get to control parts of election administration in many US states has always been astounding to me. Because when that happens in other places, we worry about that. We worry about those implications for the integrity of the process. So having established who needs to do the audit, the next thing is, what are you going to do, right? And I found it interesting to see the presentation about the amount of legislation at the state level related to audits. Very often, that doesn't even exist, right? And what you're dealing with is an existing electoral code and the extent to which within that electoral code, you can find a basis to justify an audit. So sometimes there are cases where the most that the Carter Center has to go on is that the election management body is allowed to sequester ballot boxes and handle ballots in the aftermath of an election. And that's seen as sufficient to conduct an audit, right? But it's not typical. I don't think it has become typical yet for there to be express legal codes relating to audits, though, and I know none of you want to hear this, so it's a universal issue. These audits are really only going to be as successful as they are planned for on the front end, right? So there has to be advanced planning, anticipating the kinds of issues that might arise in order to then conduct a meaningful audit in the aftermath. And so the problem is, how do you anticipate? There's any number of things that could go wrong, right? And so the best places to look are what has gone wrong in previous elections? What have people complained about? What are some new things that you're trying out, either because you just instituted major election reforms or because you got some shiny new technology, right? Those are good clues as to where problems might arise, right? Things that haven't been tried before. But then we also know about the kinds of issues that arise generally in elections. And it's really important to think systematically about this on the front end, because any number of those possibilities, you're effectively going to be asking a different kind of question to try to figure out whether or not the election essentially reflects the will of the voters. And so having some sense of, if there is this question that arises, we will proceed in this manner, is great on the front end. And the other thing I would say is that, to echo Philip's point, audit procedures don't have to be incredibly sophisticated and complicated. They can be very remedial and still be effective. And then finally, this challenge that was raised previously before. When you're using more advanced statistical techniques, you're doing something that is creating kind of a bigger gulf between you and sort of your average voter, right, as far as understanding it, and maybe creating a gulf between you and those key stakeholders whose buy-in you want to get in the aftermath of all of this. And so whatever sorts of analyses are implemented, there needs to be care and attention to how that gets communicated to stakeholders and to the public more generally, if that goal of increased confidence in the election is going to be satisfied, right? Like, you can take the most sophisticated statistical techniques and apply them and feel highly confident yourself as a scholar that you have figured something out, but if that gets lost in translation to the general public, then the goal has been defeated, essentially. Okay, a couple of examples of how this is playing out. So I will tell you, as a general rule, most audits in international contexts are not looking at things at the level of individual ballots. I think part of it is we're dealing with a lot of countries where elections, relatively speaking, are newer, and ballot secrecy is still a concern. And so the notion that in the aftermath you could just get in and look at ballots would strike people, I think, in a number of contexts as potentially problematic. So the lowest level of aggregation we tend to see in an ideal scenario is polling station data. But I will say, having said that, the Venezuelan presidential recall audit of 2004 was an exception. So you have this year-long drawn-out recall vote process that ends up leaving Hugo Chavez in power. But it had all of these steps leading up to it, right? First, there's a gathering of signatures to call for a recall. Then there's a recertification of those signatures that was actually a two-step process. Then there's the ultimate vote that comes out with a wide margin favoring the incumbent. The opposition is unhappy because their exit polls showed about a similar margin in the opposite direction. There's also discontent because 3 days before the recall vote happens, the election management body put out a protocol for an immediate audit of 1% of polling stations that failed, utterly failed. They bring people into an auditorium, they do a random draw to establish the polling stations. They come up with, I think, 50-ish polling stations that they need to go out to, and of those that the audit team goes out to, literally 6 of the polling stations agree to provide the requisite data. And the rest say, no, we're not allowed to do this. This isn't. I mean, and fair enough, the procedure came down 3 days earlier, right? There wasn't adequate time to prepare for a meaningful audit. So there's this gesture at an audit that fails. And so the Organization of American States and the Carter Center say, probably you should do it again. You should do something a little better to try to give people confidence. There was also concern because machines were used, so we're into electronic voting concerns. In particular, there was extensive debate before the recall. These were machines that both would give individuals receipts of their vote that would be printed out and they would drop in a box, and would print a systematic output machine by machine. So the question was, at the end of the day, should they print the output first or transmit it to the central tabulation system? And the concern was, if we print after transmission, how do we know it went the right way? How do we know that it wasn't, in fact, central administration feeding new results into this machine that then get printed out, right? So there was deep suspicion of the process on the front end. So the audit that was done simply took a random sample of polling locations, took those receipt boxes, and compared the electronic output to what was in the receipt boxes. And this is what they found. They found that in over 90% of stations, there was fewer than a 4-vote discrepancy between what the machine was reporting and the receipts. And they attributed that to, it was usually in a positive direction in terms of the number recorded electronically versus the number in the box. So they said, look, some people probably just forgot to drop their receipt in the box. So they did this, but then there were civil society groups that were unhappy with this, that claimed that the sampling procedure for choosing these sites was not random, and who referred back to that earlier process in the referendum of there having been signatures collected, right? And so they alleged that in places where there had been a higher rate of signatures, you saw sort of systematic suppression of votes, and that was something the auditors hadn't taken into account, this broader context. Let's look into it. So they go through and they're able to correlate signature locations with polling places and produce an analysis that is just simply the difference between how many yes votes came out of a polling place and how many original signatures approving of there being a referendum in the first place came from there. And what they saw was a correlation, right? Where there were more signatures, you got more yes votes. And so they concluded that, in fact, the opposition contention that there was sort of systematic suppression of places that had wanted the referendum was not borne out by the data. Okay, so Haiti 2010 is another example that is, I would argue, much more typical. And there, we have a first round of a presidential vote where there's going to be a second round for the top 2 vote getters. And lots of concerns about fraud, such that the Haitian government approaches the Organization for American States and says, will you please perform this analysis in order for us to be able to continue with the next round of the election with some degree of confidence. And so all of the information that the OAS had to work with was just polling station level data on turnout and what the breakdown of the votes looked like, right? And so what they were able to do is just get a sense of average turnout rates, average vote shares, and then really scrutinize outliers, right? And so they looked at every polling station, the results of every polling station with above average turnout on the grounds that, which we'll see again when I talk about Honduras, that places that have inflated turnout are also likely to be places where there's opportunity for malfeasance. And to be fair, there were some polling stations showing turnout in excess of 100% of voters registered at that polling station. Pretty good clue. Any place where there was a large margin of victory also got scrutinized, right? So they were able to establish these kind of averages and then just look at the outliers. But literally all they did for the audit was two things. Did this polling place turn in the requisite material, right? Did they turn in the requisite material, yes or no? And then part of that requisite material is a voter register with barcodes, right? Voters have barcodes associated with their name to identify them. And so if the place turned in a voter register, could we verify those individuals with the barcode? Did they show up as a real person, essentially? Nothing sophisticated. They were able, though, on the basis of those outliers failing those two basic questions, to recommend that certain polling results be not counted, and that ended up switching the second and third place winner, which in a contest where the second round's going to feature the top two vote getters is obviously very consequential. Okay. Walter mentioned Kenya, and this starts to hint at the real challenge we've got here. So Kenya 2017 did not have a formal audit, and yet the Supreme Court went ahead and overturned the election results. And the reasons will not surprise you for a lack of audit here, based on the conversation we've had. The Kenyan Election Code allows 14 days to resolve disputes associated with the election, which is widely agreed to be insufficient amount of time to conduct a meaningful audit. Furthermore, the system of vote tabulation and aggregation in Kenya, it involves multiple both paper and electronic sources that do not have sufficient checks to verify consistency across those sources. And so Walter mentioned in his work on Kenya that he was able to access the electronic sources, but those paper sources are often more difficult to get, but would be needed to perform an audit, in addition to information about the code that's being used and the security checks that are being used with the electronic system to aggregate those votes. And this is really the big message to drive home, right, is that any advanced statistical techniques you're going to want to employ require high quality data. So I would agree with Walter that where we don't have a kind of ideal situation of having paper verification or necessarily every piece of data we could want, there may still be things we could do. But in order to get sort of meaningful purchase on what's gone on in an election, we need extensive data. We need it disaggregated relative to the kind of question that you have, right? So if you have concerns about geographically distributed malfeasance or issues, then you need geographically disaggregated data. If you have concerns about temporality, and I'll show you that with Honduras in a second, then you need timestamps on everything. You need to know when votes got counted and when those counts got aggregated up to a higher level. And really the most basic issue that seems obvious, but really is a problem more often than not, is that auditors have to be able to get those data. So I gave you the example in Venezuela where the auditors show up to the polling station and they're denied. But often that happens at a central level, and I can describe that for you. So Nigeria, Guyana, and Cambodia all have 3 different regions, but all have election commissions that prohibit the release of disaggregated data. And I work in Guyana, so I have the most experience with this, and it's incredibly frustrating to sit with an election official and say, but you had to get this number for the entire district from a bunch of polling stations. Like, so where did those go? Where did those go? He says, well, we have the Excel spreadsheet, and we take each tally sheet for each ballot box, we enter the number, and we put that tally sheet in the locked ballot box. And the only way that can ever be opened is by court order. And then we just keep adding up. So no, you can't get the individual box by box or polling station by polling station results. No, can't have them. So there are these challenges of just simply accessing the right data. And I will say, I mean, it may seem like an otherworld problem, but I was actually visited by 2 observers for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, observing the US midterm elections. And they were in my office talking to me on election day because their territory was Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And they had not been able to gain access to any polling location in any of those 3 states, even just as nonpartisan observers. We also then have to worry, though, about those aggregation processes. Clearly, there was a lot of concern about what was going on in Venezuela. We have the issue in Kenya where we have paper and electronic aggregation that aren't really talking to each other. And then the other issue with data is depending on how demographic patterns break down geographically, that even if we get fine-grained data, we may still have challenges drawing meaningful inferences from it. And so Kenya is this example of just multiple challenges when it comes to the data that we need to do good analysis. But let me tell you just a little bit more about Honduras that is the data dream. So Walter set it up for you. We've got election results coming in after the election, and in the first day of counting, the opposition is ahead by a 5% margin. Then there is a computer glitch, everything goes offline, and when the results are announced a couple days later, the incumbent has come back from behind and won. And they said, no, look, it's a simple explanation. All of the opposition strongholds reported first. And I can tell you, as someone who sat in the 6th district in Kentucky and watched Amy McGrath's lead shrink as those results came in, you think, okay, yeah, that could be plausible, that it skewed towards the opposition initially, but in the end, it didn't wash out that way. So the Organization of American States, in issuing its certification of the election, which it as an observer group does, contacted Irfan Nuruddin at Georgetown, said, here are the data, we have concerns, tell us what you think. And it was incredibly rich data that not only had precinct level reports, but had timing of when those reports were aggregated into a central count, right? So we knew what precincts got counted when it was about 75% of the vote, or 57% of the vote counted with the 5% margin. And then we knew which precincts subsequently were counted. So the 2 things Irfan was able to do was to look at run simulations, right? Because he had all of the polling locations, to just run random simulations of if this 57% were counted first, what would the margin have looked like? And was able to show that, yeah, it's plausible. It's plausible that the opposition could have led by a wide margin and ultimately have lost. But it was when they looked at things over time that things got suspicious. So this is turnout. Yeah. So you see? You see what we're looking at, early on we've got, and so this is a government stronghold. The red line indicates national turnout. So this is a more participatory part of the country regardless, right? You've got that blue line even before the computer glitch. But then what we see, right, is this concentration of super high turnout after. And when we look at vote share for the opposition, again, government stronghold, so lower vote share for the opposition to start for, but that post-glitch average takes a real plunge, right? And so they were able to sort of say, no, it in fact seems like, because we knew the timing, right? Without knowledge of the timing of when these different data points came in, it wouldn't be possible to say. Final point I want to leave you with. So there are times when I want to push back a little bit on the idea that if we can get the right election result via an audit, that is an unqualified good. Because there are times when getting it right has to be put in a broader context of what the consequences of that information will be. So Afghanistan 2014, after the second round of the presidential election, there's fraud. And again, like Haiti's, a 2-round system. The UN helps Afghanistan undertake an audit that includes 100% recount. They just recount all the ballots. And nobody ever learns of the results. Instead, the losing second place candidate cuts a deal with the government to create a new power position for him. And there's basically a power sharing agreement comes out rather than ever releasing the election results. And the justifications for doing this were twofold. There were serious concerns about how opposition supporters would react. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't going to change the election. It was clear from the audit that the winner really had won. And so there were concerns about how the opposition supporters would take this news and the extent to which civil conflict might increase as a result. But the other thing that had happened is that those results showed very clearly that some of the political coalitions that had been negotiated between round 1 to round 2, right? You get a shrinking of candidates. Losers from the first round promise to throw their support behind winners or behind the second round. That some of those coalition members hadn't delivered the way that they promised. And so there were concerns about what revealing this information would do to political stability more generally within the country. So this is a pretty extreme, like we're worried about massive civil conflict in the aftermath. More moderate, though also worth pondering, is Kosovo 2010 that has this, again, very remedial automatic audit where literally all you do is for every polling location, there's a tabulation sheet and there's an official results sheet that gets turned in, and you just check that those match. That's all. Doing that resulted in over 50% of polling places being identified as results should be invalidated because, in fact, the tabulation sheet and the official results sheet didn't match. And I love it because the Observer report that talks about this says, paradoxically, this did not increase voter confidence in the election. Paradoxically, learning that half of the votes that were cast are going to get thrown out didn't make people feel better. So I think here are the lessons to connect to your own work on this. Planning is key. Again, apparently, I get it. Resources are limited. That's maybe a dream, but it makes a big difference. The need for data that is both high quality and appropriate to the particular issue that you've already identified in your planning is important. But the real other consideration is, what is the ultimate goal of this audit? Is it to have an accurate accounting of an election? Is it to bolster confidence in an election process? Is it to promote more sort of forward-looking democratic policymaking? And I want to submit that in some cases, those goals may be at odds with one another. And so that's worth considering. Thank you.
So I recognize the Q&A period is standing between us and lunch, so why don't we take a few questions, and then we'll have time to continue the discussion over lunch. I tended toward this direction during the first panel, so I'll tend toward this direction in the second panel in seeing if there are any questions to start. Yes, Lori.
It seems that It seems like we
yourself.
focus a lot of attention on choosing the ballot samples. How do we choose the race samples? That's part one, which race to check. And then the part two is, in Florida in particular, we often have 3, 4, 5-page ballots. How does that affect some of the more common ways that we would look to improve audits?
So that was Lori Edwards from Florida. That sounds like one for.
Yeah, I can try to.
Ron.
Those are great questions. I should turn on my mic, or is it on already?
It's on.
Okay, good. Yeah, so choosing the races, as states are moving towards risk limiting audits and rolling them out, often the ambitions are scaled back for those early pilots, and only a few races are audited. Ultimately, the goal should be to audit everything, and that's a conceivable goal for statewide races and countywide races, where the races that we can care about are on all the ballots in the jurisdiction and so on too. It gets a little dicey when you're dealing with very tiny races that have only sparse representation in the ballot set. And I think we have some math to do there to figure out how to do that well. So that's the answer to your question one. Well, maybe almost an answer. I mean, there are ways, and Jerome can speak to this too, because he's been doing Jerome Lovato, choosing some of the races for some of the pilots in Michigan and so on, and helping the election officials choose those. For the pilots, choosing races with relatively generous margins helps get the experience you need. But ultimately, we want to roll out and see all statewide or countywide races audited, and so there'd be no distinction there. That's going to be more work, of course, but I think it's not an audit. You're not auditing a race if you're not looking at the contest on the ballots for that race. And so it's not just, an audit isn't just looking at one race or another race, it's looking at all races, really. Second question was about multi-card ballots, having multiple pages for a ballot. Again, the processes get there. You're sampling cards rather than ballots typically. So you go into a stack of paper. The paper ballots, the paper sheets that correspond to a given ballot may not even been kept together during the processing. And so it really helps to have procedures and mathematics that deals with sampling by cards and not realizing that only maybe a third of the cards in a pile are relevant, have the contents that you care about. That can all be done. Again, it gets a little messier.
Florida's messy, that's what we learned. Oh, okay. Yes, in the back.
Yes, thank you. Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight. Mostly a question for Emily. You mentioned that it was thought that the election officials should perform the audits if at all possible. And my organization has watched a lot of audits happen. And one thing that happens is the workers all throughout the election are fixing problems and correcting things, and they're supposed to. But then during the audit, you're not supposed to correct things. And if they still correct them, the audits always come out clean, and they find absolutely nothing. Of course, those people have a conflict of interest. So why do you say the election officials should perform the audits? Because I don't think that'll work.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. So to be clear, most countries use a centralized election administration, right, at the national level. And so you would imagine, your point is incredibly well taken. You don't want the same people who worked the polling station going back and evaluating that polling station, right? The idea would be for there to be trained staff within the election management body who had some role in administering the election, but not necessarily the role that is then being evaluated. And the way that so again, this is an ideal situation. So it requires a sizable staff, right? With a lot of sort of resources and expertise. But the couple of alternatives to that are, one is that some places also have an election tribunal or an election, so you have the management and the evaluation or adjudication separated. In those cases, that election tribunal can be used. Or again, very often, it's third parties. But the reason that third parties are not seen as ideal is, again, in the context of wanting countries to build their capacity and wanting citizens to see, honestly, it's something we sort of take for granted in America, but for citizens to see their election administration as something that their country's doing, not that something is being imposed by Jimmy Carter, right? So that's the contrast, is the history of sort of external democracy promotion plays a role here. But you're right, the conflict of interest things must be taken seriously. That's part of why the best practices also include stakeholders being able to oversee the process, so that if the kinds of things you're describing arise, someone is there to flag that.
Not working?
Get the other one.
Yeah, just for the people on the, oh, there we go.
There you go.
Poof. I'd been hacked. Now, what's my question? No. So, for these international elections and the audits that have taken place, has there been any studies, data specifically, but even anecdotally, that's had an impact on public confidence in the election afterward? Because I think that's, I think your point of what is the purpose of the audit, and as I see it as an election administrator, it's really two-pronged. One, I need to have confidence that the results are accurate before I certify them. And two, to increase public confidence in those. And so, has there been any findings from these international audits?
So, yes, though not as much as we would like. So there's been the negative finding. I mean, so there was public opinion data in Kosovo that found that folks felt worse after the audited election where they did such a terrible job, right? And I do think that there was some improvement in confidence in Haiti because there had been, because the fraud had been so clear, right, to voters as it was happening, that the fact that that audit did come in and alter who got to compete with the first place winner for the presidency, that did have a positive effect. The challenge is, if you are in a place where there's a deficit of trust in political institutions more broadly, which often is exactly what we're dealing with, right? Like, we're dealing with cases where as often as there's actual fraud, there's always an incentive to accuse fraud, and it's believable. And so it's hard to say then whether what people are looking for from an audit, and this is the Afghanistan situation, is a better sense of procedural accuracy, or if they're looking for their guy to get the nod, right? And if it's the latter, then it's not clear that a well-done audit is going, but that's why that sensitivity to the broader political context is so important, yeah. And honestly, I would submit, I think that could be true some here too.
On that happy note, I want us to continue to be happy and have lunch. Why don't we first of all thank the panelists.